Genesis chapter 30 verse 1. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. Context. To better understand this verse, let's provide some context. Jacob had two wives, Rachel and Leah. Leah was able to bear children for Jacob, but Rachel remained barren. This situation caused great distress for Rachel, and it led to a sense of jealousy and envy towards her sister Leah. Rachel's longing for children. The verse begins by highlighting Rachel's desire for children. It is important to note that in biblical times, having children was considered a significant blessing. Therefore, Rachel's inability to bear children caused her great sorrow and a sense of incompleteness. Envy and jealousy. Rachel's longing for children intensified to the point of envy and jealousy towards her sister Leah, who had given birth to several children. Rachel's envy is expressed in her statement to Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. This remark shows the depth of her anguish and her desperate plea for Jacob to intervene and provide her with children. The human struggle. Rachel's reaction in this verse highlights a common human struggle, desiring something intensely but being unable to attain it. This struggle can lead to negative emotions such as envy, jealousy, and a sense of dissatisfaction with one's circumstances. God's timing and sovereignty. While Rachel's desire for children was legitimate, her approach of pressuring Jacob to give her children reveals a lack of trust in God's timing and sovereignty. It is essential to remember that God has a perfect plan for each person's life, even when it seems like our desires are unmet. Lessons for us. This verse reminds us of the importance of placing our trust in God's timing and surrendering our desires to His will. It also serves as a warning against allowing envy and jealousy to consume us when others possess what we desire. Instead, we should seek contentment in the Lord and trust that He knows what is best for us. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 portrays Rachel's deep longing for children, her envy towards her sister Leah, and her plea to Jacob to fulfill her desire. This verse provides us with insights into the human struggle for unmet desires and serves as a reminder to trust in God's timing and sovereignty. Genesis chapter 30 chapter 2. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? This verse is a part of the account of Jacob's family and the struggles faced by his wives, Rachel and Leah, in bearing children. Let's explore the context and the lessons we can draw from this verse. In this passage, we find that Jacob's wife Rachel was unable to conceive and bear children, while her sister Leah had already given birth to several children. Rachel's barrenness was a source of great sorrow and frustration for her. It is important to note that in ancient Near Eastern culture, the ability to have children was highly valued, as it ensured the continuation of the family line. The verse reveals Jacob's emotional response to Rachel's distress. Jacob's anger is directed at Rachel, which may seem harsh, but it reflects the emotional turmoil he was experiencing in dealing with the situation. It is worth noting that Rachel had previously given Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, to bear children on her behalf, Genesis chapter 30 chapters 3 through 8. However, the verse indicates that this solution did not assuage Rachel's longing for a child of her own. The latter part of the verse contains Jacob's rhetorical question, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? This statement suggests that Jacob is questioning Rachel's accusation, as if she were blaming him for her barrenness. Jacob recognizes that only God has the power to grant fertility and bring forth children. He emphasizes that he cannot replace God and that it is not within his authority to grant her children. From this verse, we can draw several lessons. The value of open communication. Jacob's emotional response to Rachel's distress highlights the importance of open and honest communication in a marriage. It is crucial to express our emotions and concerns to our partners in a respectful and loving manner. Recognizing God's sovereignty, Jacob's rhetorical question acknowledges God's sovereignty over the ability to bear children. It reminds us that some aspects of life, including fertility, are in God's hands, and we should seek His guidance, trust in his timing, and depend on his provision. Coping with unfulfilled desires. Rachel's longing for a child represents unfulfilled desires that many people experience. This verse encourages us to handle our unfulfilled desires with patience, trust, and reliance on God. He knows our hearts and has a plan for each of us, even when it may seem difficult or impossible. Avoiding misplaced blame. Jacob's response reminds us not to assign blame to others for circumstances that are beyond their control. It is important to recognize that individuals may face trials and difficulties that are not a result of someone else's actions, but rather a part of life's challenges. Ultimately, this verse serves as a reminder of the complexities and emotional struggles within families, and the importance of seeking God's guidance and relying on His provision in times of difficulty. Genesis chapter 30 verse 3, And she said, Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the complex family dynamics of Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah. To understand the context of Genesis chapter 30 verse 3, it's helpful to review the preceding verses. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob had worked for his uncle Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, whom he loved. However, Laban deceitfully gave him Leah instead. Jacob then agreed to work another 7 years to marry Rachel as well. The rivalry between Rachel and Leah arose because Rachel was Jacob's preferred wife, while Leah felt unloved. Moving into Genesis chapter 30, we find Rachel feeling distressed because she had been unable to conceive while her sister, Leah, had given birth to 4 sons. In her desperation for children, Rachel gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob as a wife, suggesting that Bilhah would bear children on Rachel's behalf. This verse reflects a cultural practice common in the ancient Near East, where a barren wife would give her maid to her husband as a surrogate to bear children on her behalf. Rachel hoped that through Bilhah, she would be able to have children upon her knees, indicating that she would take the children as her own, considering them to be her offspring. However, it's important to note that this practice was not necessarily condoned or endorsed by God. It merely reflects the cultural context of that time. The Bible often records events and practices as they occurred without explicitly endorsing or condemning them. Genesis chapter 30 verse 3 reveals the depths of Rachel's desire for children and the lengths she was willing to go to fulfill that desire. It provides insight into the struggles and complexities of relationships within Jacob's family, particularly between Rachel and Leah. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 3 sheds light on Rachel's attempt to bear children through her maid Bilhah in a cultural context where such practices were common. It serves as a reminder of the challenges and complexities faced by the characters in the narrative, illustrating the cultural norms and relational dynamics of that time period. Genesis chapter 30 verse 4, And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. This verse is part of the account of Jacob and his relationships with his wives and concubines. In this particular verse, we see that Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, gave him her maidservant, Bilhah, as a wife or concubine. As a result, Jacob entered into a marital relationship with Bilhah. To understand the significance and context of this verse, it's helpful to examine the surrounding passages and the broader narrative of Jacob's life. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob falls in love with Rachel and agrees to work for her father, Laban, for 7 years in order to marry her. However, Laban deceives Jacob by giving him Rachel's older sister, Leah, as a wife instead. After another 7 years of service, Jacob is finally given Rachel as his wife, the one he had originally desired. Rachel, though dearly loved by Jacob, was unable to conceive children. This became a source of great distress for Rachel, especially as her sister Leah had already borne several sons to Jacob. In her desperation to have children, Rachel decides to follow the cultural practice of the time and offers her maidservant, Bilhah, to Jacob as a surrogate wife. This practice was accepted in the ancient Near East and was considered a legitimate way of expanding the family and producing heirs. Genesis chapter 30 verse 4 captures the moment when Rachel gives Bilhah to Jacob, effectively establishing a polygamous relationship. The phrase, "Jacob went in unto her," indicates that Jacob engaged in sexual relations with Bilhah, which was a common way to establish a marital union in biblical times. The broader theme of this passage, and the subsequent events that unfold, is the complex dynamics within Jacob's family. The rivalry between Rachel and Leah, Jacob's two wives, is intensified by the fact that they both offer their maidservants to Jacob in order to bear children on their behalf. The resulting children, born to Bilhah and Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, are regarded as belonging to Rachel and Leah, respectively. This passage raises various moral and ethical questions, particularly regarding polygamy and the treatment of women. While the Bible records instances of polygamy, it is worth noting that such relationships often led to strife, jealousy, and tension within the family. The narrative of Jacob's family serves as a cautionary tale, demonstrating the difficulties that arise when people deviate from God's ideal of marriage as a monogamous union between one man and one woman. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 4 provides a glimpse into the cultural practices of the time and the complexities of Jacob's family relationships. It reminds us of the consequences that can arise when people deviate from God's original design for marriage and family. Genesis chapter 30 verse 5. And Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. This verse is a brief statement from the book of Genesis that describes the birth of a son to Jacob through his concubine Bilhah. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it is important to consider the context and the broader narrative of Jacob's life. In the preceding chapters of Genesis, we learn that Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, had been deceived by his uncle Laban when he wanted to marry Rachel, Laban's younger daughter. Instead of Rachel, Laban gave Jacob his elder daughter Leah in marriage, but Jacob later married Rachel as well. Bilhah and another concubine named Zilpah were given to Jacob as wives by his wives, Rachel and Leah, respectively. Genesis chapter 30 verse 5 describes the rivalry between Rachel and Leah, as they competed to bear children for Jacob. Rachel, who had initially been barren, became envious of her sister Leah, who had already borne several sons for Jacob. In her frustration, Rachel gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob as a wife so that she could have children through her. Bilhah conceived and gave birth to a son, whom Rachel named Dan, meaning, God has judged. This verse reveals a significant aspect of the cultural practices of that time, where women who were unable to conceive would sometimes offer their maidservants to their husbands in order to bear children on their behalf. It also highlights the intense rivalry and desire for children within Jacob's family, particularly between Rachel and Leah. From a biblical study perspective, this verse contributes to the overall narrative of Jacob's family and the 12 tribes of Israel. Each son born to Jacob through his wives and concubines would become the father of one of the 12 tribes. In this case, Bilhah's son, Dan, became the patriarch of the tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 5 illustrates the complex family dynamics and cultural practices of the time, while also providing insight into the lineage of the 12 tribes of Israel. Genesis chapter 30 verse 6. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son, therefore called she his name Dan. This verse is a part of the narrative of Jacob and his wives Rachel and Leah, who were sisters. In this particular verse, Rachel, who had been barren, finally conceives and gives birth to a son, whom she names Dan. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse in the broader biblical narrative. Context: Jacob had married both Rachel and Leah, but Rachel had struggled with infertility while Leah had already given birth to several sons. Rachel's longing for children led her to become envious of her sister. In her desperation, Rachel gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob as a concubine, and Bilhah bears 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali, Genesis chapter 30 verses 1 through 8. God's judgment. Rachel's declaration, "God hath judged me," expresses her understanding that her ability to conceive a child was ultimately in God's hands. Rachel recognizes that her infertility was not just a random circumstance but part of God's divine plan for her life. She acknowledges that God has intervened and granted her favor by enabling her to conceive. Answered prayer. Rachel further acknowledges that God has heard her voice. Her prayers and petitions for a child have been heard by God, and He has answered her request. This acknowledgement reflects Rachel's faith and trust in God's faithfulness and His willingness to respond to her cries for help. Naming the son. Rachel names her son Dan, which means judge, or judgment, in Hebrew. The name carries the significance of her understanding that God had judged her situation and acted on her behalf. It serves as a reminder of God's intervention and the fulfillment of His promise to Rachel. This verse highlights several important themes in the biblical narrative, including God's sovereignty, His faithfulness to His promises, and the power of prayer. Rachel's experience teaches us that God hears the cries of His people, even in times of desperation, and intervenes according to His perfect timing and plan. Additionally, we can see a parallel between Rachel's situation and the broader biblical theme of God's favor toward the barren women of the Old Testament. In several instances throughout the Bible, God blesses women who were previously unable to conceive, emphasizing His ability to bring forth new life and fulfill His purposes through seemingly impossible circumstances. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 6 showcases Rachel's faith, God's faithfulness, and the transformative power of God's intervention in the lives of His people. It reminds us that our prayers are not in vain and that God has the power to bring forth blessings even in the midst of challenging situations. Genesis chapter 30 verse 7. And Bilhah Rachel's maid conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. This verse is a part of the narrative in the book of Genesis, specifically in the story of Jacob's wives and their competition to bear children for him. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 30 verse 7, it's helpful to provide some context. In the preceding verses, Genesis chapter 30 verses 1 through 6, we learn that Rachel, one of Jacob's wives, was barren and unable to conceive. Frustrated by her inability to have children, Rachel became envious of her sister Leah, who had already borne several sons to Jacob. In an attempt to overcome her barrenness, Rachel gave her maid, Bilhah, to Jacob as a wife, so that any children Bilhah bore would be regarded as Rachel's own. In Genesis chapter 30 verse 7, we see the result of this arrangement. Bilhah conceives for the second time and gives birth to a son. This event signifies a breakthrough for Rachel, as it represents her first child. The birth of this son brings her hope and a sense of fulfillment in her desire to have children. It also adds to the growing rivalry between Rachel and Leah, as both wives try to outdo each other in bearing sons for Jacob. This passage raises several themes and lessons that can be gleaned from the broader context of the story. The importance of fertility and lineage. In the ancient Near East, having children, particularly sons, was highly valued as it ensured the continuation of one's lineage. The competition between Rachel and Leah underscores the significance they attributed to bearing children. Human struggles and emotions. The story highlights the human struggles of jealousy, envy, and the desire for validation. Rachel's longing for children reveals the deep emotional pain she experienced due to her barrenness. The consequences of impatience. Rachel's decision to give her maid to Jacob as a wife was driven by impatience and a desire to have children. This action, although culturally accepted at the time, resulted in complicated family dynamics and increased tension between the wives. God's sovereignty and His faithfulness. While the focus of this verse is on the actions of the characters, it is important to recognize that God is ultimately in control. In the broader narrative of Genesis, God fulfills His promises to Jacob by eventually blessing him with 12 sons who become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Genesis chapter 30 verse 7 serves as a stepping stone in the ongoing saga of Jacob and his family, highlighting the complexities of their relationships and the emotional struggles they faced. It reminds us of the significance of the cultural context in understanding the actions and motivations of the biblical characters. Genesis chapter 30 verse 8. And Rachel said, "With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed," and she called his name Naphtali. This verse is part of the account of Rachel and Leah, who were the wives of Jacob. In this particular passage, Rachel gives birth to her second son, and she names him Naphtali. Context. To better understand Genesis chapter 30 verse 8, it's helpful to consider the broader context of the passage. Rachel and Leah were sisters who were married to Jacob, and they had been engaged in a rivalry to bear children for him. Leah had already given birth to 4 sons, while Rachel remained barren. In her frustration, Rachel had given her maid Bilhah to Jacob as a concubine, and Bilhah had borne 2 sons. However, Rachel desired to have children of her own. Rachel's statement in this verse reveals her sense of triumph over her sister Leah. She acknowledges that she has engaged in intense wrestling with her sister, both literally and figuratively. The great wrestlings she refers to can be understood as the fierce competition and striving for Jacob's affection and the desire to bear children. Rachel considers herself victorious in this ongoing struggle, as she has finally given birth to another son, whom she names Naphtali. The name Naphtali means, "my wrestling." Rachel intentionally chooses this name for her son to commemorate the wrestling she endured with her sister and to symbolize her victory. It serves as a reminder of the struggle she faced and her triumph in finally bearing a child. Lessons and application. This verse presents several lessons we can apply to our lives. Firstly, it reveals the complexity of human relationships and the potential for rivalry and competition, even within families. The story of Rachel and Leah highlights the consequences of envy and the negative impact it can have on relationships. Secondly, we see Rachel's perseverance and determination. Despite her initial barrenness, she continued to hope and pray for a child. Her faith and persistence eventually paid off when she conceived and gave birth to Naphtali. This teaches us the importance of not giving up in the face of challenges but instead trusting in God's faithfulness and timing. Lastly, the naming of Naphtali reminds us to reflect on our own struggles and victories. Naming her son, "my wrestling," served as a personal testimony for Rachel, reminding her of the difficult journey she had undertaken and the blessings that came from it. Similarly, we can look back on our own trials and tribulations, acknowledging the ways in which God has brought us through them and celebrating the victories He has granted us. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 8 captures Rachel's proclamation of triumph over her sister and the naming of her second son, Naphtali. This verse teaches us lessons about the complexities of relationships, the importance of perseverance, and the significance of reflecting on our struggles and victories in light of God's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 30 verse 9. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the complex family dynamics between Jacob, his wives Leah and Rachel, and their respective maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 30 verse 9, let's explore the broader context. In Genesis chapter 29, we learn about Jacob's journey to Paddan Aram, where he meets Laban, his uncle. Jacob falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and agrees to serve Laban for 7 years in exchange for her hand in marriage. However, Laban deceives Jacob and gives him Leah, his older daughter, instead of Rachel. Jacob then works for another 7 years to marry Rachel. The verse in question, Genesis chapter 30 verse 9, occurs after Leah has already given birth to 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. At this point, Rachel remains childless. Feeling the pressure to bear more children and compete with her sister, Leah decides to give her maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife. Leah's actions highlight the cultural practices of the time. It was not uncommon for women to use their maidservants as surrogates or concubines to bear children on their behalf. By offering Zilpah to Jacob, Leah hoped to increase her own status within the family and gain more children through Zilpah's union with Jacob. This verse reveals the intensity of the rivalry between Leah and Rachel, as well as their desperation to bear children. Both women sought to win Jacob's favor and secure their place in his heart. However, it is important to note that the use of maidservants as wives was not in line with God's original plan for marriage. While the Bible does not explicitly comment on the morality of these actions, it presents the events and consequences as they unfolded. The consequences of this arrangement continue to be explored in subsequent verses and chapters of Genesis. Ultimately, Genesis chapter 30 verse 9 serves as a reminder of the complexities and challenges within human relationships, especially when individuals seek to fulfill their desires through their own methods rather than relying on God's guidance. The narrative in Genesis highlights the consequences of these actions and reveals the faithfulness of God despite human shortcomings. As you continue reading through the book of Genesis, you will see how the story unfolds and the various lessons that can be learned from the lives of Jacob, Leah, Rachel, and their children. Genesis chapter 30 verse 10. And Zilpah Leah's maid bare Jacob a son. Genesis chapter 30 recounts the story of Jacob and his two wives, Leah and Rachel, and their rivalry in bearing children for Jacob. In this verse, we see that Zilpah, who was Leah's maid, gave birth to a son for Jacob. To fully understand the significance of this verse, it is essential to examine the broader context and the cultural background of the time. In the biblical narrative, Jacob had initially married Rachel, whom he loved, but he was deceived by Laban, Rachel's father, and given Leah as his wife instead. Leah, though unloved by Jacob, was able to bear children, while Rachel remained barren. Desiring to have children of her own, Rachel gave her maid, Bilhah, to Jacob as a wife, and Bilhah bore two sons for Jacob. Following Rachel's lead, Leah also gave her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob, and Zilpah became the mother of two sons. The use of maidservants as surrogates for childbearing was a common practice in the ancient Near East during that time. It was considered culturally acceptable and played a significant role in the lineage and inheritance of families. The sons born to the maidservants were considered legally and socially the children of the wives they served. In the case of Genesis chapter 30 verse 10, Zilpah, Leah's maid, bore Jacob a son. This event is mentioned briefly, without providing the name of the son, as the focus of the passage is on the broader narrative of the rivalry between Rachel and Leah in their quest for children. The birth of this son through Zilpah is part of the unfolding story of the 12 sons who would become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Each son born to Jacob through his wives and their maidservants played a crucial role in fulfilling the promises made by God to Jacob's forefathers, Abraham and Isaac. While Genesis chapter 30 verse 10 does not provide specific details or further significance about this particular son, it is part of the larger narrative that highlights the complex family dynamics and the lineage that would eventually lead to the establishment of the nation of Israel. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 10 acknowledges that Zilpah, Leah's maid, bore Jacob a son, within the context of the broader story of the rivalry between Jacob's wives, their maidservants, and the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Genesis chapter 30 verse 11. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the story of Jacob and his two wives, Leah and Rachel. In this particular verse, Leah gives birth to her fifth son and names him Gad. To understand the significance of this verse, it is helpful to consider the broader context of the story. Jacob had initially intended to marry Rachel, whom he loved, but due to trickery and deception, he ended up marrying Leah first. Rachel, who was also married to Jacob, was barren and could not have children. On the other hand, Leah, although unloved by Jacob, was fertile and gave birth to several children. Leah's response upon giving birth to Gad is significant. The name, Gad, means, a troop, or, fortune. Leah saw the birth of her fifth son as a sign of good fortune, possibly referring to the fact that the birth of another son increased her standing and value in the eyes of her husband and society. Additionally, the name Gad carries a deeper meaning when considering the later history of the Israelites. Gad became the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, which descended from Jacob's sons. The tribe of Gad settled in the eastern region of the Promised Land, near the Jordan River. The tribe of Gad played a role in the conquest of Canaan and later formed an alliance with the tribe of Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 11 highlights Leah's hope and gratitude for the birth of her fifth son, Gad. It also foreshadows the future significance of the tribe of Gad within the nation of Israel. The verse serves as a reminder that even in challenging circumstances, blessings can emerge, and God's plan for His people unfolds over time. Genesis chapter 30 verse 12. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the complex family dynamics of Jacob, who later became known as Israel, and his wives Leah and Rachel. At this point in the story, Jacob had already fathered several sons with Leah and Rachel, as well as their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. In this specific verse, it is mentioned that Zilpah, who was Leah's maidservant, gave birth to Jacob's second son through her. The son's name is not mentioned here. However, it is significant in understanding the larger context of the story. To fully grasp the significance of Genesis chapter 30 verse 12, it is necessary to explore the events leading up to this verse. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob arrived in Paddan Aram, where he met Rachel, whom he loved. Jacob agreed to work for Rachel's father, Laban, for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. However, Laban deceived Jacob and gave him Leah, Rachel's older sister, as his wife instead. Jacob was then required to work an additional 7 years to marry Rachel. Leah, knowing that Jacob loved Rachel more, initially faced feelings of inadequacy and neglect. In her attempt to win Jacob's affection and bear him children, she gave her maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob as a concubine. Zilpah then bore Jacob 2 sons, Gad and Asher, Genesis chapter 30 verses 9 through 13. This verse emphasizes the role of Zilpah as Leah's maid, highlighting the complex nature of the relationships within the household. The birth of Jacob's children through his wives and their maidservants played a significant role in establishing the 12 tribes of Israel. The story of Jacob and his wives serves as a reminder of the consequences of human decisions and the challenges that can arise when we try to manipulate circumstances to achieve our desires. It also showcases God's faithfulness and His ability to work through imperfect situations to bring about His plans. By examining the broader context surrounding Genesis chapter 30 verse 12, we gain a better understanding of the complexities of Jacob's family and the significance of the births of his children. The narrative reveals the consequences of human actions and the ultimate faithfulness of God in fulfilling His purposes through imperfect circumstances. Genesis chapter 30 verse 13. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed, and she called his name Asher. Context: in the book of Genesis, we read about the patriarch Jacob and his family. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and they both had a rivalry because Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Leah, feeling unloved, sought to win Jacob's affection by giving him sons. Leah's happiness. In this verse, Leah expresses her joy and gratitude to God. She says, Happy am I. Leah's happiness comes from the birth of her son, whom she names Asher. The name Asher means happy or blessed. It is interesting to note that Leah's happiness is not derived from the love of her husband but from the blessing of having a child. Recognition and significance. Leah expresses her hope that her son will bring her recognition and blessing among other women. She says, The daughters will call me blessed. This shows her desire for acceptance and affirmation from her peers. Leah had previously felt overlooked and unloved, but now she believes that having another son will bring her honor and happiness. Lessons we can learn. True happiness. Leah's happiness is not dependent on her circumstances or the love of her husband. Instead, she finds joy in the blessings God has given her, particularly the gift of a child. This reminds us that our ultimate happiness should be rooted in God and His blessings rather than in the approval of others or worldly achievements. Contentment. Leah's journey teaches us about contentment. Though she desired Jacob's love, she finds satisfaction and fulfillment in the role of motherhood. We can learn from her example by finding contentment in our own unique situations and embracing the blessings that God has given us. God's faithfulness. Throughout the narrative of Leah, we see God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Despite her struggles, God blessed Leah with many children, and she recognizes His goodness. This serves as a reminder that God is faithful to His promises, even in the midst of our challenges and disappointments. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 13 provides insight into Leah's perspective and her longing for happiness and recognition. It teaches us about finding true joy in God's blessings, contentment in our circumstances, and the faithfulness of God in fulfilling His promises. Genesis chapter 30 verse 14. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. In this verse, we find an intriguing incident involving Reuben, Leah, and Rachel. To better understand the significance of this verse, let's explore the context and symbolism associated with the elements mentioned. The setting. The verse begins by stating that Reuben went during the days of wheat harvest. This detail is essential as it provides the seasonal backdrop for the events that follow. It helps us understand the availability of certain plants and their significance. Mandrakes. Reuben found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother, Leah. Mandrakes are a plant species with a long history of mythological and medicinal associations. In biblical times, mandrakes were believed to have fertility-enhancing properties. They were also considered an aphrodisiac and were often associated with love and desire. Rachel, who was barren at the time, desired the mandrakes in the hope that they would help her conceive. Leah and Rachel. The mention of Leah and Rachel in this verse highlights their ongoing rivalry. Both were married to Jacob, but Rachel was Jacob's beloved wife, while Leah was initially unloved. The desire for children was highly valued in that culture, and Rachel's barrenness caused her great distress. Consequently, she was willing to trade something of value, the mandrakes, for a chance at fertility. This passage reveals the complex dynamics within Jacob's household, highlighting the yearning for children and the lengths individuals would go to fulfill their desires. It provides insight into the cultural and social context of the time and the significant role of fertility in those societies. As with any passage in the Bible, it's important to consider the broader context and purpose of the book of Genesis. Genesis primarily serves as the foundation for the narrative of God's redemptive plan for humanity. While this particular verse may not directly contribute to the main themes of Genesis, it does give us a glimpse into the daily lives and struggles of the characters involved. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 14 portrays the rivalry between Rachel and Leah, as well as the desire for children. The mention of mandrakes adds a touch of cultural significance to the narrative, revealing the lengths to which people were willing to go to fulfill their desires. Genesis chapter 30 verse 15. And she said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. Context. Genesis chapter 30 verse 15 is part of the narrative about Rachel and Leah, who were sisters and wives of Jacob. They were engaged in a rivalry regarding the bearing of children for Jacob. At this point in the story, Rachel was barren while Leah had already given birth to several sons. Rachel's discontentment. Rachel's words to Leah reveal her discontentment and frustration with her situation. She accused Leah of taking her husband, referring to Jacob's affection and attention being divided between the two sisters. Rachel's desire for children and her barrenness added to her distress. The mandrakes. Rachel's demand to have the mandrakes refers to a plant believed to enhance fertility during that time. Mandrakes were considered to be an aphrodisiac and were associated with fertility and conception. The exchange: Rachel proposed a trade to Leah, offering Jacob's presents to Leah for one night in exchange for the mandrakes. She believed that through this transaction, she could increase her chances of becoming pregnant. Symbolism and themes: this passage highlights themes of envy, rivalry, and desperation. Rachel's desire for children was so strong that she was willing to offer her husband to Leah for a night. It also demonstrates the cultural beliefs and practices of the time surrounding fertility and the lengths people were willing to go to overcome barrenness. Lessons for today: while this passage may seem foreign to our modern understanding, it provides valuable lessons. It reminds us of the dangers of envy and how it can lead to unhealthy competition and strained relationships. It also underscores the importance of trusting in God's timing and plan, rather than resorting to desperate measures. Rachel's actions can be seen as a lack of trust in God's provision and an overemphasis on her own desires. God's faithfulness: although this particular passage doesn't explicitly mention God's involvement, the broader story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah demonstrates God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. Eventually, Rachel conceives and gives birth to Joseph, who plays a significant role in God's plan for the nation of Israel. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 15 portrays Rachel's discontentment and her willingness to offer her husband to Leah in exchange for mandrakes. This passage serves as a reminder to trust in God's plan, avoid envy, and recognize the consequences of desperate actions. Genesis chapter 30 verse 16. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him, and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. This verse is part of the narrative about Jacob's complicated family life. Let's break it down and explore its context and significance. Background: Jacob was married to two sisters, Leah and Rachel. Leah was the older sister and Rachel was the one Jacob truly loved. However, due to a deception orchestrated by their father Laban, Jacob ended up marrying Leah first, thinking she was Rachel. Rachel was eventually given to Jacob as a wife as well. The mandrakes: in this verse, Leah approaches Jacob with an interesting proposal involving mandrakes. Mandrakes were believed to be a plant with certain medicinal properties and were associated with fertility. Rachel desired children, but she was barren at this time, while Leah had already given birth to several sons. Reuben, Leah's eldest son, had found mandrakes in the field and brought him to his mother. Rachel wanted these mandrakes, believing they would help her conceive. Leah's proposal: Leah approaches Jacob and tells him that she has hired him with her son's mandrakes. This implies that she is offering him a night with her in exchange for the mandrakes. It's important to note that the cultural practices of that time allowed for such arrangements. Jacob's response: Jacob agrees to Leah's proposal and spends the night with her, resulting in the conception of another son. This verse illustrates the complexity and competition between the two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Rachel's desire for children, coupled with her barrenness, led her to seek the mandrakes as a potential remedy. Meanwhile, Leah, who had already borne Jacob several sons, saw an opportunity to have intimacy with her husband. In a broader context, this passage showcases the struggles within Jacob's family. It highlights the consequences of Laban's deceit and the ongoing rivalry between Rachel and Leah. Through their actions, we see how they navigated the challenges and cultural norms of their time in their quest for children and love. Overall, this verse reminds us of the humanity of biblical characters and their flaws, while also revealing the sovereignty of God in the midst of their complicated relationships. Genesis chapter 30 verse 17. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived, and bare Jacob the fifth son. This verse is a part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the complex relationships and rivalries among Jacob, his wives, and their children. To fully understand the significance of Genesis chapter 30 verse 17, it is helpful to review the preceding context. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob had been deceived by his uncle Laban and ended up marrying Leah, Laban's eldest daughter, instead of Rachel, whom Jacob loved. Jacob then worked for Laban for 7 more years to marry Rachel as well. Consequently, Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and they both desired to bear children for him. Genesis chapter 30 verse 17 is a pivotal moment in the story because it marks the birth of Jacob's 5th son, who was named Isaac. In this verse, we see that God responds to Leah's plea and opens her womb, allowing her to conceive and bear another child for Jacob. The significance of this verse lies in the fact that it reveals God's compassion and attention to Leah's longing for Jacob's love. Throughout the preceding chapters, Leah had been overshadowed by her sister Rachel, who was cherished by Jacob. However, in this instance, God shows mercy and favor towards Leah by granting her another son. This event underscores a recurring theme in the book of Genesis, namely, God's sovereignty in the lives of individuals and the fulfillment of His promises. Despite the complicated family dynamics and personal desires, God intervenes in the lives of Jacob and his wives, ensuring that His plan for the multiplication of Jacob's descendants is realized. Furthermore, this verse reminds us that God hears the cries of the oppressed and responds to their needs. Leah, feeling unloved by her husband, found solace and comfort in God's provision. It serves as a reminder that God is attentive to our deepest longings and is always ready to extend His grace and mercy to those who seek Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 17 showcases God's responsiveness to Leah's desire for Jacob's affection and highlights His sovereignty in the unfolding of His divine plan. It serves as a testament to God's faithfulness and His willingness to bless even in the midst of complex human relationships. Genesis chapter 30 verse 18. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Isaac. In this verse, we witness a significant event in the life of Leah, one of the wives of Jacob. To understand the context and significance of Genesis chapter 30 verse 18, we need to examine the preceding verses. In Genesis chapter 29, we learn that Jacob had arrived in the land of his mother's relatives, seeking a wife. He meets Rachel, the younger daughter of Laban, and falls in love with her. Jacob agrees to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. However, Laban deceives Jacob by giving him his elder daughter, Leah, instead of Rachel, on their wedding night. In Genesis chapter 29 verses 31 through 35, we see that Leah, feeling unloved and unappreciated, begins to bear children for Jacob, while Rachel remains barren. She gives birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah successively. With each birth, Leah hopes that her husband will finally love her. However, the cycle continues, and Rachel remains childless. In Genesis chapter 30, Rachel becomes envious of her sister's ability to bear children. She offers her maid Bilhah to Jacob as a wife so that she might have children through her. Bilhah gives birth to Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah also provides her maid Zilpah to Jacob, who then bears Gad and Asher. The situation becomes a competition between the sisters, each trying to gain Jacob's affection through childbearing. It is in this context that Genesis chapter 30 verse 18 takes place. Leah gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife, and Zilpah conceives and bears a son. Leah sees this as a sign of God's favor towards her, and she acknowledges that God has given her my hire, or reward for giving her maiden to her husband. She names her son Isaac, which means reward or hire. Leah's perspective in this verse reveals her longing for validation and love from Jacob. She hopes that by giving her maid to her husband and producing another child, she will finally gain his affections. However, it is important to note that Leah's fulfillment does not come from the birth of her children or from Jacob's love but from recognizing God's providence and blessings in her life. Leah's focus on God's role in her life serves as a reminder to us that true fulfillment comes from a relationship with God rather than from external circumstances or human approval. She acknowledges that God is the one who provides and rewards her, rather than relying solely on her own efforts or the favor of her husband. This passage also highlights the complexities and challenges of relationships within a family. The story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel showcases the consequences of deception, jealousy, and competition. It serves as a reminder that pursuing personal desires at the expense of others can lead to strife and pain. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 18 captures Leah's acknowledgement of God's blessing and provision in her life. It reminds us that true fulfillment comes from recognizing God's hand in our circumstances and trusting in His faithfulness, rather than seeking validation solely from human relationships or achievements. Genesis chapter 30 verse 19. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob the sixth son. To better understand this verse, it's helpful to provide some context. Jacob had married Leah and Rachel, who were sisters. However, Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, and this caused tension between the two sisters. Leah had already given birth to 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Now, in Genesis chapter 30 verse 19, Leah conceives again and bears Jacob her 6th son. This verse highlights the significance of childbirth and the lineage in the Old Testament. In the culture of that time, bearing children, especially sons, was highly valued and seen as a blessing from God. Each new child brought hope, joy, and increased status within the family. It's worth noting that the naming of children in the Bible often carries deeper meanings and reveals something about the circumstances or feelings of the parents. In the case of Leah's children, the names she gives them reflect her emotions and desires. By the time of the 6th son's birth, Leah had already experienced mixed feelings of being unloved and trying to win Jacob's affection. In previous verses, we see that she named her sons based on her emotional state at the time. For example, Reuben means see, a son, signifying her hope that Jacob would notice and love her because she had borne him a child. Similarly, Simeon means hearing, expressing Leah's desire for Jacob to hear her and acknowledge her. Unfortunately, the verse itself doesn't provide specific details about the 6th son's name or any additional circumstances surrounding his birth. However, the naming patterns in previous verses suggest that Leah's choice of name may have been influenced by her longing for love and acceptance from Jacob. Overall, this verse serves as a continuation of the story of Jacob and his wives, emphasizing the ongoing dynamics and struggles within their relationships. It also highlights the importance placed on childbirth and the lineage in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 30 verse 20. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. Context. To fully understand Genesis chapter 30 verse 20, it's important to consider the surrounding verses and the broader context. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob had worked for Laban, his uncle, for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, Laban's younger daughter. However, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah, his older daughter, in marriage instead. Jacob then worked another 7 years to marry Rachel. Leah, although initially unloved by Jacob, had given birth to 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. In Genesis chapter 30, Rachel, who was initially barren, becomes jealous of Leah's children and gives her maidservant, Bilhah, to Jacob as a wife. Bilhah bears 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah, in response, gives her maidservant, Zilpah, to Jacob as a wife, and Zilpah bears 2 sons, Gad and Asher. It is in this context that Leah exclaims in Genesis chapter 30 verse 20. Leah's perspective. Leah's statement reveals her desire for Jacob's attention and affection. She believed that God had blessed her with a good dowry or gift in the form of her 6 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. By bearing Jacob many children, she hoped that her husband would finally dwell with her, showing her the love and companionship she longed for. God's providence. Although Jacob's love was initially directed towards Rachel, God showed his providence by allowing Leah to bear Jacob many sons. In the culture of that time, A woman's worth and value were often associated with her ability to bear children, especially sons. Through Leah's children, God was fulfilling his promise to bless Jacob with numerous descendants. Leah acknowledged God's role in her blessings, recognizing that it was God who had endued or granted her the gift of children. Naming of Zebulun, after expressing her gratitude for the good dowry given to her by God, Leah named her sixth son Zebulun. The name Zebulun means dwelling or honor. Leah's hope was that, with the birth of Zebulun, Jacob would finally dwell with her, giving her the honor and recognition she desired. Lessons for us. Genesis chapter 30 verse 20 reminds us of several important lessons. Firstly, it highlights the significance of recognizing and acknowledging God's blessings in our lives. Like Leah, we should give thanks to God for the gifts and blessings He provides us, whether they are tangible or intangible. Secondly, it reminds us of God's sovereignty and His ability to work through challenging circumstances. Despite Jacob's initial lack of affection for Leah, God used her as an instrument to fulfill His promises. We can trust that God is always working behind the scenes, even in difficult situations, to accomplish His purposes. Lastly, Genesis chapter 30 verse 20 teaches us the importance of seeking validation and love from God rather than solely relying on human relationships. While Leah desired Jacob's love, she ultimately recognized that her worth came from God's love and blessings. Likewise, we should find our identity and value in our relationship with God, seeking His approval above all else. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 20 showcases Leah's acknowledgement of God's blessings in her life and her desire for Jacob's affection. It reminds us to be grateful for God's gifts, trust in His sovereignty, and find our worth in Him rather than in the validation of others. Genesis chapter 30 verse 21. And afterwards she bare a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Context: this verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that recounts the story of Jacob, his wives, and the birth of their children. Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel, and each of them desired to bear children for him. Rachel, who was initially barren, experienced a deep longing to have children and was envious of her sister Leah, who had already given birth to several sons. Explanation: in this verse, Rachel finally conceives and gives birth to a daughter, whom she names Dinah. The name Dinah means judged or vindicated. Although the verse itself is short, it marks an important milestone in the narrative, as Rachel had been struggling with infertility while Leah had already borne sons. Lessons and themes. God's faithfulness. Rachel's prolonged period of infertility serves as a reminder of God's sovereignty over human fertility. Despite the delay, God eventually blesses Rachel with a child. This teaches us that God's timing is perfect, even when we may experience delays or challenges in various aspects of our lives. Personal significance. The act of naming her daughter Dinah suggests that Rachel found comfort and a sense of justice in finally having a child. Naming a child in biblical times often carried significant meaning, and Dinah's name likely represented Rachel's longing for vindication or a sense of being heard by God. Family dynamics. The story of Jacob's family, with its complex relationships and rivalries between the wives and their children, highlights the tensions and difficulties that can arise in families. The birth of Dinah is another milestone in this ongoing narrative, setting the stage for future events involving Dinah and her brothers. The value of daughters. In a culture that often placed more emphasis on the birth of sons, the birth of Dinah reminds us of the value and significance of daughters. Every child is a precious gift from God, regardless of their gender, and holds inherent worth and purpose. Application. From this verse, we can draw several applications for our lives today. Trust in God's timing. When facing challenges or waiting for the fulfillment of our desires, we can trust that God is faithful and will work things out in His perfect timing. Find contentment in God's blessings. Like Rachel, we should learn to find contentment in the blessings God has given us, rather than being consumed by envy or comparison. Cherish and affirm the value of every child. As parents or individuals interacting with children, We should recognize and affirm the inherent worth and value of each child, regardless of societal expectations or cultural biases. By examining this verse within its broader context and drawing relevant lessons and applications, we can glean valuable insights from the biblical narrative and apply them to our own lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 22. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. This verse is a significant moment in the life of Rachel, the wife of Jacob, as she had been barren and unable to conceive. Let's explore the context, key themes, and lessons we can learn from this verse. Context. In Genesis chapter 30, we find the story of Jacob's marriages to Leah and Rachel, sisters who were also the daughters of Laban. Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, but she was barren, while Leah had already borne children for Jacob. Rachel's barrenness caused her great distress and led to competition and tension between her and Leah, who bore several sons. Key themes. God's remembrance. The phrase, "and God remembered Rachel," indicates that God intervened and showed his favor and compassion towards Rachel. It implies that God had not forgotten Rachel's desire for children and decided to bless her by opening her womb. This theme emphasizes God's faithfulness and sovereignty in fulfilling his promises. God's hearing. The verse continues, "and God hearkened to her." This highlights God's attentiveness and responsiveness to Rachel's prayer and longing. It reveals that God hears the cries and petitions of his people and acts in accordance with his perfect timing and purpose. Fertility and blessing. The opening of Rachel's womb signifies God's provision of fertility and blessing upon her. It signifies a turning point in her life and brings joy and fulfillment to her desire for children. Lessons. God's timing. Rachel's journey of waiting and longing for children teaches us about the importance of trusting God's timing. Sometimes, we may face delays and unanswered prayers, but God's remembrance and response are not dependent on our timeline. We need to patiently wait and continue to seek him, trusting that he knows what is best for us. God's faithfulness. Rachel's story reminds us that God is faithful to his promises. Even when circumstances seem impossible, God can intervene and bring about miraculous changes. We should hold on to his faithfulness and trust that he will fulfill his purposes in our lives. Prayer and petition. Rachel's experience emphasizes the power of prayer and seeking God's intervention. We should not hesitate to bring our desires and needs before God, for he hears and responds according to his will. Persistent prayer demonstrates our dependence on him and strengthens our relationship with him. God's sovereignty. This verse highlights God's sovereignty over fertility and the opening of the womb. It reminds us that ultimately, the ability to conceive and bear children is in God's hands. We should acknowledge his authority over all aspects of our lives, including the fulfillment of our desires. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 22 portrays God's remembrance, attentiveness, and blessing upon Rachel, opening her womb. It teaches us about God's faithfulness, the importance of trusting his timing, the power of prayer, and his sovereignty. Rachel's story encourages us to wait patiently, seek God in prayer, and trust in his perfect plans for our lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 23. And she conceived, and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. Context. This verse is part of the narrative about Rachel and Leah, two wives of Jacob, who were sisters. They were both competing for Jacob's affections and trying to bear him children. Rachel had been barren, while Leah had already given birth to several sons. Understanding the historical context, Rachel's desire for children, Rachel's inability to conceive was a source of great distress for her. In the culture of that time, being childless was considered a reproach, a cause for shame and social stigma. Rachel longed to bear children and experience the joy of motherhood. Observing the verse, conception and birth. In this verse, Rachel finally conceives and gives birth to a son. This event brings immense joy and relief to Rachel. Acknowledging God's intervention, Rachel recognizes that her ability to conceive and bear a child is a result of God's intervention. She attributes her successful pregnancy to God's direct involvement in her life. Reflecting on the message, God's timing and sovereignty, Rachel's prolonged barrenness was a test of her faith and patience. However, when the time was right, God blessed her with a child. This verse reminds us that God's timing is perfect, and He has the power to bring about change in our lives. God's faithfulness and grace. Rachel acknowledges God's faithfulness in removing her reproach. The birth of her son is a tangible sign of God's grace and mercy toward her. It serves as a reminder that God is compassionate and has the ability to transform our circumstances. Relating the verse to broader themes. The fulfillment of promises. Rachel's conception and the birth of her son are a fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob regarding their descendants. This event continues the lineage of the chosen people through Jacob. Overcoming shame and reproach. Rachel's barrenness had caused her shame and reproach. However, God's intervention turned her reproach into joy. This theme echoes throughout the Bible, where God often lifts the burden of shame and brings restoration to those who trust in Him. Application to our lives. Trusting God's timing. Like Rachel, we may face periods of waiting and disappointment in various aspects of life. This verse encourages us to trust in God's timing and have faith that He can turn our situations around in due course. Recognizing God's provision. When we experience breakthroughs or blessings, it is essential to acknowledge that they come from God. Expressing gratitude and giving credit to God for His provision can deepen our relationship with Him. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 23 showcases Rachel's joy and gratitude as she conceives and bears a son, recognizing God's intervention in her life. It reminds us of God's faithfulness, His ability to transform our circumstances, and the importance of trusting in His perfect timing. Genesis chapter 30 verse 24. And she called his name Joseph, and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." This verse is a significant moment in the biblical account of Jacob's family and specifically focuses on the birth of Joseph. Let's explore the context and meaning of this verse in a brief Bible study. Context: Genesis chapter 30 verse 24 occurs within the narrative of Jacob's marriages and the birth of his 12 sons who would become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, respectively. These women had been competing with each other to bear sons for Jacob. In this particular verse, Rachel, who had previously been barren, gives birth to her firstborn son, Joseph. Meaning and significance. Naming Joseph. Rachel named her son Joseph, which means, "he will add," or, "may he add." This name carries a symbolic meaning, reflecting Rachel's hope and prayer for God to bless her with another son. It also reflects her desire for God to add to her joy and fulfillment in her marital relationship with Jacob. Acknowledging God's role, Rachel's statement, "The Lord shall add to me another son," reveals her recognition of God's involvement in her life and her acknowledgement that God is the one who ultimately grants children. It demonstrates her faith and trust in God's ability to fulfill her desires. Divine intervention. Rachel's previous infertility was a source of great distress for her. The birth of Joseph, therefore, was a significant blessing and a reminder of God's faithfulness in answering her prayers. It showcases God's power to overcome barrenness and bring forth life, highlighting His providential care and intervention in the lives of His people. Foreshadowing. Joseph's birth marks a turning point in the narrative, as he would go on to play a crucial role in Israel's history. Joseph's life unfolds through various trials and triumphs, ultimately leading him to become a powerful ruler in Egypt and a key figure in the preservation of Jacob's family during a severe famine. This verse serves as a foreshadowing of the remarkable future that awaits Joseph. Lessons and applications. Trusting God's timing. Rachel's journey of barrenness and eventual conception reminds us that God works in His perfect timing. Even in difficult seasons, we are encouraged to trust in His faithfulness and wait patiently for His plans to unfold. Prayer and faith. Rachel's faith and prayer exemplify the importance of seeking God in times of need. It is a reminder for us to bring our desires, struggles, and requests before the Lord, knowing that He hears us and has the power to answer our prayers. Recognizing God's provision, Rachel's declaration acknowledges God as the source of her blessings. It prompts us to acknowledge God's provision and sovereignty in our lives, understanding that every good gift comes from Him. God's purposes. Joseph's birth, the first fruit of Rachel's womb, was part of God's grand plan to preserve the Israelite lineage. It demonstrates that God can work through ordinary circumstances to accomplish extraordinary purposes. We are reminded that God's plans for our lives are often far greater than what we can imagine. Genesis chapter 30 verse 24 teaches us the value of trust, prayer, and acknowledging God's provision and sovereignty in our lives. It encourages us to persevere in faith, knowing that God has a plan and purpose for every aspect of our journey. Genesis chapter 30 verse 25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, and to my country. Context. Genesis chapter 30 verse 25 is part of the narrative of Jacob's time with Laban, his father-in-law. Jacob had worked for Laban for a total of 20 years, marrying both Leah and Rachel, Laban's daughters. In this verse, Rachel has just given birth to Joseph, who would later become an important figure in the history of Israel. Key points. The birth of Joseph. Rachel, who had been barren for many years, finally gave birth to her first son, Joseph. This was a significant event for Jacob and Rachel, as it brought them great joy and fulfilled their desire to have children. Jacob's desire to return home. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob expressed his desire to return to his homeland. He asked Laban, his father-in-law, to allow him to leave and go back to his own country. This indicates that Jacob had spent a considerable amount of time living with Laban and serving him. God's blessings. Throughout the narrative, we see that God had been blessing Jacob abundantly, despite Laban's deceit and attempts to take advantage of him. Jacob's flocks had increased significantly, and he had become prosperous during his time with Laban. Jacob recognized that it was God's favor and blessing that had brought him success and desired to return to his own place. Lessons and applications. God's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 30 verse 25 reminds us of God's faithfulness to His promises. Despite the challenging circumstances and Laban's deceptive ways, God had blessed Jacob and his family. This serves as a reminder that even in difficult situations, we can trust in God's faithfulness to provide for us and fulfill His promises. Prioritizing family and home. Jacob's desire to return to his own place and country highlights the importance of family and home. While it is essential to work and fulfill our responsibilities, we should also prioritize our relationships and ensure that we are investing in our families. Jacob's longing for home can inspire us to value our own families and create a nurturing and loving environment. Recognizing God's blessings. Jacob acknowledged that the prosperity and blessings he experienced were a result of God's favor. It is important for us to recognize and acknowledge God's hand in our lives. Gratitude and acknowledging God's blessings help us maintain a humble and thankful attitude, fostering a deeper relationship with Him. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 25 captures a significant moment in Jacob's life, where he expresses his desire to return to his homeland after Rachel gives birth to their son, Joseph. This verse reminds us of God's faithfulness, the importance of family, and the need to recognize God's blessings in our lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 26. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Context. Genesis chapter 30 recounts the story of Jacob and his relationship with Laban, his uncle. Jacob had worked for Laban for 20 years, marrying his daughters Leah and Rachel. Laban was reluctant to let Jacob go, as he recognized that Jacob's presence brought blessings and prosperity to his household. Faithfulness and labor. Jacob's plea to Laban reflects his desire to be released from his service. After years of dedicated work, Jacob felt it was time for him to return to his homeland. He reminds Laban of his faithful service, indicating that he had fulfilled his responsibilities and it was time for him to move on. God's blessings. Throughout the story, it is evident that God had blessed Jacob abundantly. Despite Laban's attempts to deceive and exploit him, Jacob's flocks had multiplied, and his wealth had increased. Laban acknowledged that God's blessings were upon Jacob and that his prosperity was linked to Jacob's presence. God's providence. Jacob's request to leave Laban's household and return to his own land demonstrates his reliance on God's providence. He trusted that God would continue to bless and protect him as he embarked on this new phase of his life. Jacob understood that his well-being and success were ultimately in God's hands. Reflection. This verse provides an opportunity for personal reflection on themes of faithfulness, trust in God's provision, and recognizing the season of change in one's life. It reminds us to honor our commitments and fulfill our responsibilities, trusting that God will bless and guide us as we seek His will. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 26 highlights the culmination of Jacob's service to Laban and his desire to return to his homeland. It also emphasizes the importance of recognizing God's blessings and trusting in His providence as we navigate life's transitions. Genesis chapter 30 verse 27. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. In this verse, Laban, who was Jacob's father-in-law, is speaking to Jacob. To understand the significance of this verse, it's helpful to provide some context. At this point in the narrative, Jacob had been working for Laban for a significant period of time. He had initially fled from his home to escape his brother Esau's anger after receiving Isaac's blessing, Genesis chapter 27 verses 41 through 45. Jacob arrived at Paddan Aram, where Laban, his mother's brother, resided. Laban offered Jacob the opportunity to work for him in exchange for marrying his daughters Rachel and Leah. Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, but Laban deceived him by giving him Leah instead. Jacob then had to work another 7 years to marry Rachel, the woman he loved, Genesis chapter 29 verses 15 through 30. During Jacob's time working for Laban, he experienced a series of miraculous events and blessings from God. For example, despite Laban's efforts to cheat Jacob out of his fair wages, God intervened and ensured that Jacob prospered, Genesis chapter 31 verses 7 through 12. Jacob's flock multiplied abundantly, and he became wealthy. In Genesis chapter 30 verse 27, Laban acknowledges that he has recognized the blessings that have come to him as a result of Jacob's presence. Laban admits that he has learned by experience that the Lord has blessed him for Jacob's sake. It is interesting to note that Laban, though a pagan, acknowledges the role of a divine power in Jacob's blessings. He attributes his prosperity to God's favor upon Jacob. This verse highlights the principle of divine favor and blessing. Laban's observation reveals that God's favor and blessing can extend beyond the person directly receiving it. Jacob's faithfulness, diligence, and trust in God resulted in Laban experiencing blessings as well. Laban's acknowledgement also shows that God's presence in someone's life can be evident to those around them, even if they do not share the same faith. From a broader perspective, this verse reminds us of the way God can work through individuals to bring blessings and favor to others. It demonstrates that our faithfulness and obedience to God's will can have a positive impact on those around us, sometimes even those who may not share our beliefs. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 27 highlights the interplay between God's favor, human relationships, and the ripple effect of blessings. It serves as a reminder of the far-reaching consequences of our actions and the potential for God to use us as instruments of His blessings and grace in the lives of others. Genesis chapter 30 verse 28. And he said, Appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. Context. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's time with his uncle Laban. Jacob had agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry Laban's daughter Rachel, But Laban deceived Jacob and gave him Leah, Rachel's older sister, as his wife. Jacob then worked another 7 years for Laban to marry Rachel. In the process, Jacob's flocks increased, and he became prosperous. Acknowledging Jacob's diligence, Jacob's work ethic, Genesis chapter 29 verse 20 tells us that Jacob served Laban for Rachel's sake, and he did so with dedication and diligence. His commitment to his responsibilities is noteworthy. Negotiating wages. Jacob's request. In Genesis chapter 30 verse 28, Jacob approaches Laban and asks him to set his wages. After years of service, Jacob desires to establish a fair arrangement for his continued work. A fair compensation. Jacob doesn't want to be taken advantage of or mistreated by Laban. He seeks a clear agreement on what he will receive for his labor, indicating his desire for transparency and fairness. Trust in God's provision. God's blessing. Throughout Jacob's time with Laban, God blessed him abundantly. Genesis chapter 30 verse 27 says that God had blessed Laban through Jacob's service. Jacob recognizes God's favor and acknowledges it as the source of his prosperity. Relying on God, by asking Laban to determine his wages, Jacob demonstrates his trust in God's provision. He understands that his prosperity ultimately comes from God and that God will take care of him in the negotiations. Application to our lives. Diligence in our work. Like Jacob, we should approach our responsibilities with diligence and commitment. Colossians chapter 3 verse 23 encourages us to work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that God rewards our efforts. Seeking fairness and transparency. When dealing with others, it's important to seek fairness and transparency. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 11 reminds us that honest scales and balances belong to the Lord, and all the weights in the bag are of his making. Trusting in God's provision. Just as Jacob trusted in God's provision, we should rely on God's faithfulness in our lives. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33 reminds us to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to us. In Genesis chapter 30 verse 28, we see Jacob's request to establish fair wages with Laban while recognizing God's blessing and provision in his life. This passage encourages us to approach our work diligently, seek fairness in our dealings, and trust in God's provision for our needs. Genesis chapter 30 verse 29. And he said unto him, Thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. This verse is part of a conversation between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. To understand the context of this verse, let's explore the broader narrative leading up to this point. In Genesis chapter 29 verse 1, Jacob arrives at the land of Haran and encounters Laban, who happens to be his mother Rebekah's brother. Jacob falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and agrees to serve Laban for 7 years in exchange for her hand in marriage. However, Laban deceives Jacob by giving him Leah, his older daughter, on their wedding night. Jacob then agrees to serve another 7 years to marry Rachel, whom he truly loves. Throughout this period, Jacob works diligently as a shepherd, taking care of Laban's flock. Jacob's hard work, despite the initial deceit, serves as the backdrop for the conversation in Genesis chapter 30 verse 29. In this verse, Jacob is addressing Laban, reminding him of his faithful service. He acknowledges that Laban is well aware of how diligently he has worked and how he has taken care of Laban's livestock. Jacob is essentially reminding Laban of his loyalty and commitment, which becomes relevant in the subsequent verses where Jacob expresses his desire to leave and return to his homeland with his wives and children. This passage reflects Jacob's growing frustration with Laban's mistreatment and deceit. Jacob has come to realize that Laban continuously changed the terms of their agreement and manipulated him to his advantage. Thus, Jacob uses this moment to assert himself and remind Laban of his faithful service. As we consider the broader themes in this passage, we can reflect on the importance of integrity, hard work, and maintaining our commitments. Jacob's dedication to his work, even under difficult circumstances, serves as a lesson in perseverance and faithfulness. It also highlights the significance of open and honest communication in resolving conflicts and addressing grievances. Genesis chapter 30 verse 30. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude, and the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now when shall I provide for mine own house also? This verse is part of the story of Jacob, who worked for his uncle Laban for several years. Jacob had married Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel, and had been tending Laban's flocks. However, Laban had deceived Jacob multiple times by changing the terms of their agreement and taking advantage of him. In this particular verse, Jacob is speaking to Laban, expressing his dissatisfaction with the way Laban had treated him. Jacob points out that when he first arrived to work for Laban, Laban had very little, but now, through Jacob's hard work and God's blessing, Laban's possessions had multiplied greatly. Jacob acknowledges that the increase in Laban's wealth was a result of God's blessing since Jacob's arrival. Moreover, Jacob raises a concern for his own family. He questions Laban about when he will be able to provide for his own household. After years of service, Jacob desires to establish his own wealth and secure a future for his wives and children. This verse highlights several important lessons that can be drawn from Jacob's words. Faithfulness and blessings. Despite the mistreatment Jacob endured, he acknowledges that it was God's blessing that had caused Laban's increase. Jacob recognizes that God was with him and had blessed him in his work. This emphasizes the importance of remaining faithful to God and acknowledging His role in our lives, even in difficult circumstances. The importance of providing for one's family. Jacob's concern for his own household demonstrates the responsibility and care he felt towards his wives and children. It reflects the biblical principle of providing for one's family and highlights the importance of fulfilling our obligations towards our loved ones. Seeking justice. Jacob's words to Laban also reveal his desire for fairness and justice. He had worked diligently for Laban, and he felt it was time for Laban to honor their agreement and treat him justly. This reminds us of the importance of seeking justice and fairness in our dealings with others, while also trusting God to bring about His justice in His timing. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 30 provides insights into Jacob's character and his relationship with Laban. It reminds us of the importance of acknowledging God's blessings, fulfilling our responsibilities towards our families, and seeking justice in our interactions with others. Genesis chapter 30 verse 1. And he said, What shall I give thee? And Jacob said, Thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. Context. Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 is part of the narrative of Jacob's time working for his uncle Laban. Jacob had fled from his home to escape his brother Esau's anger and had arrived in Paddan Aram, where Laban, his mother's brother, lived. Jacob had fallen in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and had agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry her. However, Laban deceived Jacob and gave him his older daughter, Leah, in marriage instead. Jacob agreed to work for another 7 years to marry Rachel, whom he loved. Study. The context of Jacob's service. By the time we reach Genesis chapter 30 verse 1, Jacob had already served Laban for a significant period of time, working as a shepherd tending to Laban's flock. During this time, Jacob's wages had been changed multiple times by Laban, as he continuously sought to benefit himself at Jacob's expense. Jacob's request. In this verse, Jacob is conversing with Laban and is asking for a favor. Jacob proposes that Laban doesn't need to give him any material possessions as wages. Rather, Jacob offers to continue taking care of Laban's flock in exchange for certain conditions that would benefit him. Faithfulness and dedication. Jacob's statement reveals his commitment and loyalty to his work. Despite Laban's deception and constant attempts to undermine him, Jacob expresses his determination to continue faithfully tending to Laban's flock. This demonstrates Jacob's integrity and work ethic. Negotiating with Laban. Jacob's request can be seen as an attempt to negotiate better terms for himself. Laban had changed Jacob's wages 10 times. Genesis chapter 31 verse 7, and Jacob likely desired stability and fairness in their arrangement. Trusting God's provision. Jacob's response to Laban indicates that he recognized his ultimate dependence on God for provision. While he desired better conditions, he did not demand any immediate compensation from Laban, but instead relied on God's faithfulness to bless him. Lessons and applications. Faithfulness in difficult circumstances. Jacob's commitment to his work despite the challenges he faced is an important lesson for us. Sometimes, we may find ourselves in unfavorable circumstances, but it is essential to remain faithful and diligent in our responsibilities. Trusting God in negotiations. Jacob's approach to negotiating with Laban demonstrates the importance of seeking God's guidance and provision in our dealings with others. Trusting in God's wisdom and provision can lead to favorable outcomes. Integrity and work ethic. Jacob's dedication to his work teaches us the value of integrity and a strong work ethic. Regardless of the circumstances or the treatment we receive, we should strive to give our best effort and maintain our integrity. Reliance on God's provision. Jacob's response serves as a reminder that ultimately, our provision comes from God. While it is important to work and negotiate fairly, we should trust in God's faithfulness to provide for our needs. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 offers insights into Jacob's character, his negotiations with Laban, and his trust in God's provision. It encourages us to remain faithful and diligent in our responsibilities, seek God's guidance in negotiations, and trust in His provision for our lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 2. In the day thou shalt find out thy servants by my hand. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, thou shalt be counted stolen with me. Genesis chapter 30 verse 2 is part of the narrative of Jacob's dealings with his father-in-law, Laban. At this point in the story, Jacob has been working for Laban for many years and has acquired a large flock of livestock. However, Laban has been dishonest in his dealings with Jacob, frequently changing the terms of their agreement regarding the animals. In this particular verse, Jacob proposes a test to Laban in order to establish a fair agreement between them. Jacob suggests that Laban separate out any goats that are speckled and spotted, as well as any sheep that are brown, from the rest of the flock. Laban would then count these animals and take them as his own, leaving the remaining animals for Jacob. This test is Jacob's attempt to prove his honesty and integrity. By agreeing to separate out the unique and uncommon animals, Jacob is essentially saying that any animals born in the future with these traits will be considered Laban's and not Jacob's. Jacob is willing to accept this condition in order to ensure fairness in their agreement. The verse reflects the tension and mistrust that existed between Jacob and Laban. It demonstrates Jacob's willingness to comply with Laban's demands in order to preserve peace and maintain his own integrity. It also serves as a reminder of the challenges Jacob faced while working for Laban and the lengths he went to in order to secure his own livelihood. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 2 highlights themes of honesty, trust, and the importance of maintaining one's integrity even in difficult circumstances. Genesis chapter 30 verse 33. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Chapter every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, thou shalt be counted stolen with me. Context. In this passage, Jacob is speaking to his father-in-law, Laban, after Laban proposed a new agreement regarding the flocks. Laban had been attempting to deceive Jacob by changing the terms of their agreement, but Jacob responded with a plan to ensure his fair treatment. Historical background. Jacob had served Laban for many years in order to marry his daughters, Rachel and Leah. Initially, Laban promised Jacob that he could keep any speckled, spotted, or dark-colored sheep and goats as his wages. However, Laban continually changed the terms of the agreement in an attempt to gain the advantage. Jacob's proposal. Jacob proposes a fair agreement to Laban, ensuring that he will not take any sheep or goats that are not speckled or spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep. By doing so, Jacob acknowledges that the unblemished animals rightfully belong to Laban and will not take them, even if they are mistakenly placed among his own flocks. Jacob suggests that his righteousness and honesty will be evident in the future, serving as a testament to his integrity. Spiritual lessons. Integrity and honesty. Jacob's statement reflects his commitment to honesty and integrity in his dealings with Laban. He wants his righteousness to testify for him and prove his trustworthiness. Trusting in God's provision. Throughout his life, Jacob relied on God's guidance and provision. In this situation, Jacob trusted that God would bless him with the speckled and spotted livestock, even though their natural occurrence was rare. Fulfilling obligations. Despite Laban's dishonesty, Jacob maintains his commitment to fulfill his responsibilities. He ensures that only the rightful animals are counted as his wages. Application. Integrity in our dealings. As believers, we are called to maintain integrity and honesty in all areas of our lives. Our actions should reflect God's righteousness and testify to our faith. Trusting in God's provision. Just like Jacob, we can trust in God's provision for our needs. We should seek His guidance and have faith that He will provide for us in unexpected ways. Fulfilling commitments. We should honor our commitments and responsibilities, even when faced with difficult or unfair situations. Our actions should display Christ-like character, regardless of the actions of others. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 33 highlights Jacob's commitment to integrity, trust in God's provision, and fulfillment of his obligations. It serves as a reminder for us to maintain honesty, trust in God's faithfulness, and honor our commitments in our daily lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 34. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Genesis chapter 30 verse 34 is a verse spoken by Jacob, also known as Israel, to his uncle Laban. To understand the context, we need to examine the preceding events in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 29, Jacob fled from his home after deceiving his father Isaac and receiving the birthright and blessing intended for his older brother Esau. He journeyed to his uncle Laban's house in Paddan Aram. There, Jacob met Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, and fell in love with her. He made an agreement with Laban to work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. After fulfilling his part of the agreement, Jacob was deceived by Laban and was given Rachel's older sister, Leah, as his wife instead. Jacob then made a deal with Laban to work another 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. Over time, Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, bore him children, and their maidservants also bore him children. By the time we reach Genesis chapter 30 verse 34, Jacob has spent a total of 20 years serving Laban. During these years, Jacob had faced various challenges and experienced God's faithfulness, protection, and provision. Laban had continually tried to deceive and manipulate Jacob, changing his wages multiple times. Nevertheless, Jacob's flocks and herds had increased significantly under God's blessing. In this verse, Jacob expresses his desire to leave Laban's house and return to his homeland with his wives and children. He reminds Laban of the years he had served faithfully, highlighting his hard work and dedication. Jacob seeks permission from Laban to depart, asserting that Laban is aware of the extent of his service. Genesis chapter 30 verse 34 shows us a crucial aspect of Jacob's character. Despite the mistreatment he endured, Jacob remains respectful and maintains his integrity. He approaches Laban, his employer, with a request instead of simply leaving. His words imply that he desires to move on from the difficulties he faced and establish his own household. This passage can teach us several lessons. Diligence and perseverance. Jacob's commitment to Laban's service for 20 years demonstrates his persistence and work ethic. It reminds us of the importance of being diligent and dedicated in our endeavors, even in challenging circumstances. Honoring agreements. Jacob fulfilled his obligations despite Laban's deceptive practices. This highlights the value of honoring our commitments and being people of integrity, even when others may not uphold their end of the bargain. Seeking God's guidance. Throughout Jacob's journey, God's presence and blessing are evident. As we face trials and uncertainties, we should seek God's guidance and trust in His faithfulness, knowing that He can turn difficult situations around for our good. Moving forward from adversity, despite the mistreatment and hardships Jacob endured, he sought to move forward and build a life for himself. This encourages us to learn from our past experiences, let go of bitterness, and embrace new beginnings with hope and faith. In summary, Genesis chapter 30 verse 34 captures a pivotal moment in Jacob's life where he seeks to leave Laban's household after many years of service. It emphasizes Jacob's integrity, perseverance, and his trust in God's faithfulness. This passage invites us to reflect on our own commitment, integrity, and reliance on God as we navigate life's challenges. Genesis chapter 30 verse 5. And he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's dealings with his father-in-law Laban. To understand the significance of this particular verse, we need to examine the broader context. In Genesis chapter 30, Jacob has been working for Laban for several years, tending to his flock of sheep and goats. Jacob had initially worked for Laban in order to marry his daughters, Rachel and Leah. However, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him Leah instead of Rachel as his wife, and Jacob ended up marrying both Leah and Rachel. The verse you mentioned takes place after Jacob and Laban had made an agreement regarding the division of the flock. Jacob proposes a plan to Laban in which he would keep any sheep or goats that were speckled, spotted, or with white in their coats as his wages. Laban agrees to the proposal, and they establish a system for breeding the animals. In this verse, Jacob executes his plan by separating the specific goats and sheep described, the ring-straked and spotted he-goats, the speckled and spotted she-goats, those with some white in them, and the brown among the sheep. He then entrusts these animals to the care of his sons, effectively separating them from the rest of Laban's flock. This separation of the animals was part of Jacob's strategy to increase his own wealth and provide for his growing family. He believed that by breeding these specific animals, he would have a greater number of speckled and spotted offspring, which would ultimately contribute to his own prosperity. It's important to note that this chapter of Genesis is not only about Jacob's strategic breeding practices but also contains a deeper spiritual lesson. Throughout the narrative, we see God's providence at work, ensuring that Jacob prospers despite Laban's attempts to deceive and manipulate him. God blesses Jacob's efforts, and through divine intervention, the animals that Jacob breeds produce a considerable increase in his own flock. Genesis chapter 30 verse 5 reminds us that even in challenging circumstances, when others may seek to exploit or cheat us, we can trust in God's faithfulness. Jacob's success was not solely a result of his own strategies and efforts but ultimately came from God's blessing and providence in his life. This verse also illustrates the importance of faithfulness and integrity in our dealings with others. While Jacob was wise in his approach to breeding the animals, he did not resort to dishonesty or trickery to gain an advantage over Laban. He worked within the agreed-upon terms, separating the animals according to Laban's specifications. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 5 highlights Jacob's strategic breeding practices and his separation of specific animals as part of his agreement with Laban. It reminds us of God's faithfulness and the importance of integrity in our dealings with others. Genesis chapter 30 verse 6. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Context: this verse is part of the narrative in Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob's time working for his father-in-law, Laban. After Jacob's marriage to Leah and Rachel, Laban made an agreement with Jacob that he would continue working for him in exchange for the opportunity to increase his own flocks. This verse occurs during this period of Jacob's service to Laban. Importance of separation. The verse begins by mentioning that Laban set a 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. This action of separating their flocks suggests that Laban wanted to distance himself from Jacob in order to prevent him from having any influence over Laban's livestock. It highlights the growing tension between the two men and indicates Laban's desire to maintain control over the situation. Separation can sometimes be necessary in certain relationships or circumstances to establish boundaries and protect oneself. Jacob's responsibility. The latter part of the verse states that Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Despite the separation, Laban still entrusted Jacob with the care of his remaining flocks. This demonstrates Jacob's faithfulness and responsibility in carrying out his duties. Jacob's commitment to his work and his willingness to fulfill his obligations even in difficult circumstances serve as examples of diligence and integrity. God's faithfulness. Throughout this narrative, we see God's faithfulness to Jacob. Despite Laban's attempts to deceive and manipulate Jacob, God blessed Jacob's efforts, causing his flocks to increase. It is important to note that God was working behind the scenes, fulfilling his promises to Jacob. This story reminds us that even when faced with challenging situations or working under difficult individuals, we can trust in God's faithfulness to guide and bless us. Application. Faithfulness in responsibilities. Like Jacob, we should strive to be diligent and responsible in our work, regardless of the circumstances. Our actions should reflect our commitment to fulfilling our obligations with integrity and excellence. Establishing boundaries. There may be times when it becomes necessary to set boundaries and separate ourselves from unhealthy or detrimental relationships. We should discern when it is appropriate to establish healthy boundaries for our own well-being and to maintain a sense of balance in our lives. Trusting in God's faithfulness. Even in challenging situations, we can trust in God's faithfulness to guide and bless us. We should rely on His wisdom and seek His guidance as we navigate through difficult circumstances, knowing that He is with us and will fulfill His promises. Remember, studying the Bible involves exploring the context, understanding the meaning of the verses, and considering the broader themes and applications. It is always beneficial to consult commentaries, study guides, or seek the guidance of a spiritual leader to gain a deeper understanding of the text. Genesis chapter 30 verse 7. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar, and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled white strakes in him, and made the white appear which was in the rods. This verse is part of the narrative of Jacob's interactions with Laban, his father-in-law, during the time when Jacob worked for him. At this point, Jacob had negotiated a deal with Laban to increase his own wealth by selectively breeding Laban's flocks, particularly the sheep. Genesis chapter 30 verse 7 describes one of the methods Jacob used to influence the breeding process. To understand this verse better, it is helpful to consider the context leading up to it. In the preceding verses, Jacob and Laban had agreed on the terms of their arrangement. Jacob would keep all the spotted and speckled sheep and goats born from Laban's flock, while Laban would keep the solid-colored animals. Jacob wanted to increase his own share of the flock, so he devised a plan using rods of green poplar, hazel, and chestnut tree. In ancient times, people believed that physical stimuli could affect the physical characteristics of animals. Jacob employed a selective breeding technique based on this belief. He took rods of various types of wood and peeled them in a way that exposed the white inner part of the wood. By placing these stripped rods in front of the flocks while they were mating or conceiving, he aimed to influence the appearance of the offspring. The verse concludes by stating that Jacob's method worked, as it caused the offspring to have markings that were similar to the appearance of the stripped rods. In subsequent verses, it is revealed that Jacob's selective breeding technique was successful, and he gained a larger portion of the flock as a result. Genesis chapter 30 verse 7 serves as a reminder of the resourcefulness and determination of Jacob. It shows his willingness to use unconventional methods to secure a better outcome for himself. However, it is important to note that the effectiveness of Jacob's method was likely due to God's intervention and blessing, as shown in later verses. This account highlights God's sovereignty and the way He works through human actions to accomplish His plans. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 7 provides insight into the cultural beliefs and practices of the time while revealing a particular episode in Jacob's life. It reminds us to be creative, diligent, and attentive to the opportunities and resources available to us, trusting in God's guidance and provision. Genesis chapter 30 verse 38. And he set the rods which he had pilled before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. Context. To understand Genesis chapter 30 verse 38, it's important to consider the broader context. This verse is part of the story of Jacob and his relationship with his father-in-law, Laban. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, and during that time, Laban had deceived him by changing his wages and giving him less desirable livestock. Jacob's strategy. In this verse, Jacob devises a plan to increase his own flock. He took rods of various tree species, peeled off the bark in some areas, and placed them in the gutters in the watering troughs. The purpose of this was to influence the breeding process of Laban's flock. Jacob believed that the sight of the peeled rods would somehow affect the animals' offspring, causing them to be speckled or spotted. Divine intervention. Interestingly, the following verses, Genesis chapter 30 verse 39 through verse 43, describe how Jacob's plan actually worked. The flocks conceived and produced offspring with speckled, spotted, and striped patterns. It is important to note that this outcome is attributed to God's intervention rather than Jacob's strategy. Jacob acknowledges in later verses that it was God who granted him success. Symbolism and lessons. This passage can be seen as a reflection of Jacob's resourcefulness and determination. However, it also serves as a reminder of God's sovereignty and involvement in our lives. While Jacob may have implemented a practical approach, it was ultimately God's blessing and intervention that caused the outcome. This teaches us the importance of recognizing God's providence and acknowledging His role in our successes. Trusting in God's plan. Jacob's actions in this passage also highlight his desire for wealth and prosperity. However, it's worth noting that his focus on material gain led to a strained relationship with Laban and ultimately created further complications in his life. This serves as a reminder for us to prioritize seeking God's will above worldly possessions and trusting in His plan for our lives. Honesty and integrity. Although Jacob's actions resulted in a favorable outcome, it's essential to consider the ethical aspects of his behavior. While the exact mechanism behind Jacob's strategy is unclear, it can be argued that his actions contained an element of deceit. As followers of God, we are called to live with honesty and integrity, trusting in God's provision rather than resorting to deceptive practices. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 38 presents an interesting account from Jacob's life, showcasing his resourcefulness and God's intervention. It serves as a reminder to trust in God's plan, seek His will, and live with integrity, even in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 30 verse 39. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. This verse is part of the account of Jacob's time working for his father-in-law, Laban. Jacob had made an agreement with Laban to tend to his flocks in exchange for specific wages. However, Laban was consistently changing the terms of the agreement to Jacob's disadvantage. In this particular verse, Jacob devised a plan to increase his own flock and ensure that he would have a fair share of the offspring. He used rods made of poplar, almond, and plane trees, which he peeled white stripes on, revealing the underlying color. He then placed these striped rods in front of the flocks when they came to drink water. The belief at the time was that the appearance of the rods would affect the offspring that the flocks would produce. As a result of Jacob's action, the flocks conceived and gave birth to young animals that were ring-straked, speckled, and spotted, rather than the usual solid-colored offspring. This outcome enabled Jacob to build up his own flock and increase his wealth. The significance of this verse lies in the demonstration of Jacob's ingenuity and resourcefulness. Despite facing ongoing challenges and Laban's attempts to deceive him, Jacob used his knowledge of animal breeding to his advantage. However, It is important to note that the success of Jacob's plan was also attributed to God's intervention in subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 30 verse 40 through verse 43. This passage serves as a reminder that God can work through various means, including the everyday circumstances of our lives, to fulfill His purposes. It also highlights the principle of reaping what one sows, as Jacob's careful breeding efforts ultimately led to his prosperity. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 39 presents an intriguing account of Jacob's methods to increase his flock and demonstrates how God can use human actions to accomplish His plans. Genesis chapter 30 verse 40. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ringstraked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban, and he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. Context: in Genesis chapter 30, we find Jacob working for his father-in-law Laban. Laban had promised Jacob his younger daughter Rachel in marriage after he served him for 7 years. However, Laban deceived Jacob by giving him his elder daughter Leah instead. Jacob then agreed to work another 7 years for Rachel. The verse in question is part of the account of Jacob's dealings with Laban regarding the increase of his flocks. Separation and selective breeding. Jacob wanted to increase the number of his flocks, and he devised a strategy for selective breeding. He separated the lambs and arranged the mating process so that the strongest and healthiest animals would produce offspring with desirable traits. By placing the faces of the flocks toward the ringstraked, which is streaked or speckled, and brown animals, he ensured that the resulting offspring would inherit these characteristics. Laban's flock and Jacob's flock. The verse also mentions that Jacob put his own flocks by themselves and did not mix them with Laban's cattle. This separation was to prevent any crossbreeding between the flocks, ensuring that the increase in Jacob's flock would not benefit Laban. It also ensured that Jacob's flock remained distinct and that he would receive what he had been promised by Laban. God's involvement. In the subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 30 verses 41 through 43, it is revealed that Jacob's selective breeding strategy was successful, and his flock increased in number and quality. The text suggests that God blessed Jacob's efforts and caused the stronger animals to conceive and produce offspring with the desired traits. Jacob's wise and strategic actions were part of God's plan to bless him and fulfill His promises to Jacob's ancestors, Abraham and Isaac. Lessons from the passage. This verse highlights Jacob's resourcefulness, diligence, and ability to adapt to his circumstances. It also teaches us about God's faithfulness to His promises. Despite Laban's deceptive practices, Jacob persevered and worked diligently, trusting in God's providence. Through Jacob's actions, we see the importance of being wise stewards of the resources and opportunities God provides, while also acknowledging that God ultimately blesses and prospers our efforts. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 40 showcases Jacob's selective breeding strategy to increase his flocks. It also emphasizes God's involvement in blessing Jacob's efforts and fulfilling His promises. This passage teaches us valuable lessons about resourcefulness, diligence, and God's faithfulness in our lives. Genesis chapter 30 verse 41. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. This verse is a part of the narrative of Jacob's time with his father-in-law, Laban, and describes a unique method that Jacob used to increase his own flock of livestock. To understand the context of this verse, let's briefly review the preceding events. Jacob had worked for Laban for many years, primarily as payment for marrying Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. Laban had initially deceived Jacob by giving him Leah as his wife instead of Rachel, whom Jacob loved. However, Jacob continued to work for Laban and eventually acquired considerable wealth in the form of livestock. In Genesis chapter 30 verses 32 through 43, Laban and Jacob negotiate a deal regarding the division of the flock. Jacob requests that he be allowed to keep all the spotted and speckled animals as his share. Laban initially agrees, but he tries to manipulate the situation by removing all the spotted and speckled animals from the flock, leaving only the solid-colored ones for Jacob. However, through a combination of skill and divine intervention, Jacob manages to increase his share of the flock in a miraculous way. In Genesis chapter 30 verses 37 through 39, Jacob takes rods of green poplar, almond, and chestnut trees, and peels strips of bark in a way that reveals streaks of white. These rods are then placed in the watering troughs where the flock comes to drink. The idea behind this practice was that the appearance of these rods would have an influence on the characteristics of the offspring conceived near them. According to the narrative, this unconventional method somehow caused the stronger and healthier animals among Laban's flock to conceive and produce offspring with spotted and speckled patterns. As a result, Jacob's flock began to flourish, and Laban's flock dwindled. It is important to note that this passage does not provide a scientific explanation for how this phenomenon occurred. Instead, it portrays Jacob's actions as an act of faith and trust in God, who ultimately blessed him by increasing his wealth. From a spiritual perspective, this account highlights the theme of God's faithfulness and provision. Despite the deceitful practices of Laban, Jacob's faith and reliance on God enabled him to prosper. It also demonstrates that God can work through unconventional means to fulfill his promises. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 41 shows us that Jacob's livestock multiplication was a result of his faith in God and God's blessings upon him. It serves as a reminder that we, too, can trust in God's faithfulness and provision, even in challenging circumstances. Genesis chapter 30 verse 42. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the events surrounding Jacob's time with his uncle Laban. Jacob had been working for Laban for a period of 20 years, and during this time, he had acquired wealth in the form of livestock. In this particular verse, the context is that Jacob had devised a breeding strategy to increase his own flock. He had noticed that Laban's flock was stronger and healthier, while his own flock was weaker. To remedy this situation, Jacob placed the stronger animals in front of the weaker ones while they were breeding. This was a practice that was believed to influence the appearance and strength of the offspring. As a result of Jacob's selective breeding technique, the stronger animals gave birth to stronger offspring, and the weaker animals gave birth to weaker offspring. Consequently, Jacob's flock grew stronger, while Laban's flock remained weaker. This verse serves as a demonstration of Jacob's resourcefulness and ingenuity in managing his livestock. It also illustrates the providence and blessing of God upon Jacob's efforts. Jacob's success in building his own flock can be seen as part of God's fulfillment of the promise made to him earlier in Genesis chapter 28 verse 14, where God said, "And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." From a broader perspective, this verse highlights the theme of God's faithfulness to his promises. Despite the challenges Jacob faced while working for Laban, God remained with him and blessed him, enabling him to prosper and fulfill the destiny God had set before him. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 30 verse 42 demonstrates Jacob's strategic approach to breeding his flock and the resulting increase in his own wealth. It also emphasizes God's faithfulness to his promises and his involvement in Jacob's life. Genesis chapter 30 verse 43. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and menservants, and camels, and asses. This verse is part of the narrative in the book of Genesis that describes the life of Jacob, one of the patriarchs of the Israelites. In the preceding verses, we see that Jacob had worked for his uncle Laban for several years in order to marry Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. During this time, Jacob faced many challenges and obstacles, including Laban's deceitful practices. Genesis chapter 30 verse 43 marks a turning point for Jacob, as it highlights the blessings and prosperity that God bestowed upon him. Let's delve deeper into the context and explore the significance of this verse. God's faithfulness and provision. Throughout Jacob's life, God remained faithful to his promises and provided for him. Despite Laban's attempts to exploit Jacob's labor, God blessed him abundantly. Jacob's increase in cattle, maidservants, menservants, camels, and donkeys indicates the material wealth and prosperity that he acquired through God's blessings. Fulfillment of God's covenant. Jacob's prosperity aligns with the promises made by God to his forefathers, Abraham and Isaac. In Genesis chapter 26 verse 4, God had promised Isaac, Jacob's father, saying, "And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." This verse indicates that Jacob's increase in wealth is an indication of the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham and Isaac. Symbolic representation. The abundance of cattle, maidservants, menservants, camels, and donkeys can also be seen as symbolic. Cattle, in particular, were considered a sign of wealth and prosperity in ancient times. Jacob's growing herds symbolize his increasing influence and prominence in the land. The possession of maidservants and menservants suggests a rise in social status and power. God's favor amidst adversity. Jacob's journey up until this point was not without hardships and challenges. He faced Laban's trickery, favoritism, and various obstacles. However, despite these trials, God's favor rested upon Jacob, enabling him to overcome adversity and prosper. This serves as a reminder that God's blessings are not contingent on a trouble-free life, but can be experienced even in the midst of difficulties. Overall, Genesis chapter 30 verse 43 highlights the fulfillment of God's promises to Jacob, his increasing prosperity, and the evidence of God's faithfulness throughout his journey. It serves as a reminder of God's provision, favor, and blessings in the lives of those who remain faithful to him, even in the face of challenges and trials.